Welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. I'm Brendan Ray, and welcome to Chapter 2, Bytown. Chapter 1 saw the history of the Ottawa region from the perspective of nature and the Algonquin, and then the French who made the area home. The first section of our podcast may have ended with the fall of New France and the ascension of the English, but French people still lived there in the territory, and, not to give any spoilers, but they're here still. Likewise, the Algonquin would hunt and fish on the Kitchissippi, the Tena-Gadineau-Zibi, and the Pisapkaji-Nawang, the Ottawa, Gatineau, and Rideau rivers respectively, even if their numbers hadn't fully recovered from where they had been prior to the Beaver Wars. In this episode, we are going to look at the relationship between the British, as the now sole European power in the region, and the various indigenous powers within the formerly French domains, now English domains, between the fall of Quebec in 1759 and the Quebec Act in 1774. Chapters or ages, epochs or eras are great for categorizing themes, but there really are no absolute starts and finishes in history. 1763 saw an end to the influence of the French crown, but as we know, there's still a huge French population in Ontario, and more so in Quebec. From here on in, the French and Catholic populations would be under an English and Protestant political system. The Algonquins, Wendat, and Odawa are also still here, but they would bear the consequences of having sided with the French in the war. They were now left to negotiate with the victors on their own, and the conquering English were not done conquering just because peace had been declared with the French. The relationship between the Indigenous nations and the only European power left was about to take shape in a dramatic convulsion. With the fall of Quebec and the Treaty of Paris 4 years later, legitimizing the end of Nouvelle France as a political entity in North America, outside of the tiny islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon off the Newfoundland coast, while the English occupied Acadia and the settlements of the St. Lawrence River, much of the French holdings inside the continent were still being held by a mix of French military and civilian officials. In these days before email and satellite communications, they would have to be informed via messenger that they were now under the protection of England's crown. The English and French colonial missions had been very different from one another since their inceptions. Nouvelle France was a commercial enterprise that brought fish and furs to France for the enrichment of merchants, and this was economically achieved by enlisting the aid of a series of alliances between a mosaic of different indigenous stakeholders. The indigenous trappers and hunters would bring furs to French trading outposts across the Great Lakes Basin, eventually making their way to either Montreal or Quebec City via the Ottawa or the St. Lawrence, where they would be inventoried and prepared for export to the furriers of France to transform into the finished products of hats, coats, gloves, and footwear. The large settlements of the lower St. Lawrence were growing only insofar as they needed to feed themselves and to meet the basic needs of the merchants, soldiers, and bureaucrats. Missionaries were sent out amongst the indigenous nations to assist with the exploration of the continent, to fortify alliances, and gather intelligence, as much as they were there to altruistically spread the good news. Conversely, the English were also there for commerce, but also to farm and practice trades and build cities and communities, often along the lines of different Protestant confessions. While there was some trade with indigenous nations, the English colonies that were to become the United States were more focused on Atlantic trade, importing slaves from Africa, sugar from the Caribbean, and luxury goods from Europe, and exporting foodstuffs, tobacco, and cotton to Old Blighty. When the English moved into the Great Lakes region to take possession of the various French forts and trading posts, they did not see these holdings as isolated depots for a trading network. These were outposts to secure territory for further settlement. The Great Lakes and the Ottawa Valley were strategic avenues for settlement, not a Silk Road for furs. When the English arrived, they informed the Iroquoian Huron-Wendat, as well as the Anishinaabe Odawa, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Algonquin, that the French were gone and the English were there to be the major players going forward. The English were now asserting direct dominion over 3 regions that had been a part of the French trading network, but not directly controlled. Those being the Pays en Haut, the lands where Lakes Superior, Huron, and Michigan meet, and south into the modern state of Michigan, the Ohio country, south of Lake Erie, which English colonists in the 13 colonies had been coveting for annexation, and the Illinois country, south of Lake Michigan. Ohio and Illinois countries do not 100% correspond to the modern states that share their names. So when I say Ohio country, think Ohio plus neighboring areas, and the same for Illinois. Over the war with the French, the English debt jumped to £50 million, which needed to be addressed. For those curious, the current national debt of the UK is £2.9 trillion. Paying the debt could be accomplished by cutting services, but that would alienate the military. Raising taxes, but that would alienate merchants. Or selling land, which would alienate their indigenous allies. If you're not sure which one they picked, you haven't been paying much attention. Settlement wasn't a random act that people did. Nobody stood up and said, "I guess I'll go 100 miles west and build a farm. Here I go." The Crown assumed ownership of the land west of Pennsylvania, for example, then sold the rights to a settlement company, who then recruited customers looking to migrate. Typically, the contract would include obligations of infrastructure that the company would be responsible for, building roads or a courthouse within a certain time frame, and the labor of the settlers was a part of that contract. Settlement companies were ecstatic about the victory over the French because they could now begin moving into the Ohio and Illinois countries, and they wouldn't even need to lease the land from the Crown. It was empty and ripe for the taking, if you ignore the people living there, obviously, which is what they did. They began in the west of Pennsylvania and Connecticut, looking at the Ohio country as a prime target for settlement, as there was already some residual infrastructure there from the French, in what would otherwise be considered open land, again, indigenous inhabitants notwithstanding. The consequences of the 7 Years' War was to be a license to print money for these companies. Every year during the French era, the colonial administrators would present gifts to the various sachems and councils in the Pays en Haut, the Ohio, and the Illinois countries, who would then share the gifts with their community elders, who would then in turn share the gifts with their members. This was the chain of gift-giving that kept the status quo running smoothly. The French were then invited, as guests, to share the bounty of the land, and a copacetic relationship held for the enrichment of both sides. The assumption by the people of the Great Lakes region was that this would continue with the English. You may recall the old grade school adage about when you assume what you make out of you and me. General Jeffrey Amherst, the Commander-in-Chief of North America, determined that these gifts were a form of bribery and created a culture of dependency and were unbecoming of the Crown to a subject people. This argument may sound familiar today, so I suppose we should get used to it. He also insisted that no guns or gunpowder be sent to any of the indigenous nations, lest they get any ideas. Now, I've said indigenous nations, not indigenous allies, and that's because as far as Amherst was concerned, these were not allies. Allies were peers. These were subject peoples in the general's eyes, peasants of the forest, not even freeholders. Central to the situation, as the English asserted dominance over the French withdrawal, was land, which the English were taking. Since they were taking the land, they were also taking the capacity to produce food. The various nations of the Great Lakes were either agriculturalists or semi-nomadic. They were not hunter-gatherers, as used to be maintained. On top of this were the diseases that were still present and spreading in flare-ups. Things would fall apart, the center could not hold, and sooner or later mere anarchy would be loosed upon this world. That came championed by an Odawa leader named Pontiac. Once the French had signed away the peace with the English moved into the territory of the Odawa, the Huron, the Algonquin, the Mississauga, and other tribes which they believed were possessions of the French to be ceded to England, rather than allies of the French who enjoyed independence. The treatment of the indigenous nations in the wake of the victory of Quebec, particularly under Amherst, became increasingly lofty and patrician. Many of the nations of the Pays en Haut believed, correctly in their paranoia as it would turn out, that the English intended to subjugate them all without respect or mercy for traditional alliances. Many French trading outposts consisted of little more than a blacksmith and a storesman. These were not fledgling colonies. Just because something was named Fort such and such didn't necessarily mean that it was something that we would recognize as a fort. Even large outposts like Fort Detroit were only home to a few dozen soldiers, coureurs de bois, missionaries, and other officials. In 1761, the English were arriving with soldiers, settlers, farmers, surveyors, and administrators. The shift was impossible not to notice, and the Odawa under Pontiac sent envoys to the Mississippi Territory, trying to enlist French and even Spanish support against the English, but for naught. The movement from bad feelings to violent confrontation began when the English settlers started to simply occupy the land and set up farms, villages, and other infrastructure. Ignoring the early aggressions that started in 1761, English writers would say that Pontiac's war began 2 years later in 1763, when Pontiac and 600 Iroquois and 300 Anishinaabe moved on Fort Detroit. For the nations that had been on the fence to this point, it presented a time to either resist the English or acquiesce. Remaining neutral would be too much of a challenge for many nations, though the Haudenosaunee tried to manage that, despite the enthusiastic anti-English rhetoric of the Seneca, which would eventually turn into an all-out war. On the Lake Erie shore, the English had built a small fort and christened it Fort Sandusky. Local Wyandot had insisted that this was their land and that the fort should be taken down. Wyandot is the Huron dialect of the Iroquoian language. The Wyandot were the sparse remnants of the Hurons, who were once the dominant nation of the northern Great Lakes, and were now a small collection of bands in the Ohio country, formerly subjects of the Haudenosaunee. When they heard word of the siege of Fort Detroit, they knew that the time was now or never, and on 16 May they entered Fort Sandusky under the guise of holding a council and took the fort. They killed all 15 soldiers, their commander, and a handful of traders, ritually scalping them before triumphantly burning the fort to the ground. By the end of May, Pontiac's war was spreading across the formerly French-claimed territories that the English now were trying to assert dominion over. By the end of June, 9 of the 11 English-held forts in the so-called Indian country were either occupied or destroyed. English settlers were forced to flee back to English territory, particularly around the Fort Pitt area in Pennsylvania. The future Pittsburgh became so crowded with refugees, poor housing conditions, and a lack of sanitation that our old friend Pestilence joined the party, this time in the form of smallpox. The commander of Fort Pitt, Colonel Henry Bouquet, was a Swiss mercenary in the employ of the English crown. Bouquet wrote to Amherst, suggesting, "Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox amongst the disaffected tribes of Indians? We must on this occasion use every stratagem in our power to reduce them." Amherst thought that this was a capital idea. Simply capital. The English gave some blankets to the Delaware as a bribe to end the siege. The blankets were fresh out of a hospital where people were being treated for smallpox, and people had died of that malady while wrapped with the blankets in question. The effectiveness of this instance of biological warfare was surprisingly limited, actually. The infections of smallpox amongst the Delaware was comparable to the rates among the refugees in town, But the guilty action and the guilty intention, the actus reus and the mens rea, is what turns a sin into a war crime, regardless of the level of measurable success. Closer to home, in September, Fort Niagara was not attacked directly, but outside of the fort, an Odawa and Ojibwe war party was joined by the Seneca, acting independently of their Haudenosaunee confederates, in attacking a supply train along the Niagara portage. 2 companies from the fort were sent to rescue the teamsters and were defeated in what the newspapers of Philadelphia and New York called the Devil's Hole Massacre. The Devil's Hole Massacre took the life of 70 British soldiers and was the worst battle of the war. While any loss of life is a personal tragedy for the dead, their families, and loved ones, 70 dead doesn't really compare directly with the 1,300 that died on the Plains of Abraham. Pontiac's war was not a war of set-piece battles, but of skirmishes and raids. The indigenous forces didn't try to hold forts. They burned them. They didn't try to occupy towns, villages, and farms. They tried to run the English out so that they would not come back. It was, however, a war of refugees, where thousands of people would be displaced and forced to move elsewhere. Pontiac's forces were fundamentally fighting to maintain the status quo, whereas the English goal was the occupation and ethnic cleansing of the land and the replacement of the existing population with their own. The advantages for the indigenous nations at this type of warfare were broad. Fighting and raiding in small units in the forest meant that the British could not make use of their numerical advantage, their organization and logistics were compromised, and their cannon was impractical. You can't roll a cannon through terrain and be ready to fight at a moment's notice. They were subject to and incapable of ambushes. By 1764, several indigenous nations and the English were ready to discuss peace, and a conference was held in Fort Niagara. 24 indigenous nations met with Sir William Johnson to bring formal end to the war. Molly Brant, sometimes called Mary Brant, was Sir William's indigenous consort and helped him with some of the required niceties of the situation. Present were representatives of the Haudenosaunee, Seneca, Wyandot of Detroit, Menominee, Algonquin, Nipissing, Ojibwe, Mississaugas, and others. Absent were the Odawa of Detroit, the Wyandot of Sandusky, and the Lenape and Shawnee of the Ohio. The reason that those nations refused to attend the peace conference was that the treaty would assert that the Crown had dominion over all the lands of the Indian country, but the land was rightfully occupied by the respective nations that were there now. Only the Crown could negotiate with the indigenous nations for purpose of military and civilian occupation. This was to end the business of settlement companies that had caused so much difficulties as they extended the colonies beyond the borders of the original 13. The abstaining nations did not want to recognize the authority of the Crown over their lands and insisted on an alliance of nations, not the subordination upon which the English insisted. This treaty removed much of the momentum of Pontiac's war. It was agreed not on paper, but on wampum, which is a part of why the Canadian governments have refused to honor this treaty. The nations who did agree would go on to honor their alliances with the Crown during the War of 1812, when all 24 nations would take up arms against the invading Americans and alongside the British and Canadians. The significance of this treaty for the city of Ottawa is that the Algonquin, the Kitchissippirini, and the Nipissing of the Ottawa Valley were theoretically to be safe from exploitation from ruthless land speculators and random settler violence. There weren't exactly huge amounts of huddled masses yearning to settle in the Ottawa Valley at this time, as the nearest recruiting pool were all French Catholics from the St. Lawrence settlements, and the Crown was more concerned with their containment than expansion. The reality would be that neither the British nor their American nor Canadian offspring would be great at honoring treaties. While the Treaty of Fort Niagara brought the Algonquin out of the war, it did not obligate them to fight alongside the English against Pontiac, where the war continued on the western frontier of British North American holdings. An end to the war, in most practical senses, gradually came as more and more of Pontiac's allies signed independent treaties with the English. The fighting stopped. Most of the indigenous nations had agreed to accept the sovereignty of the English crown, and those that didn't, including Pontiac, opted to leave the English dominion and cross over the Mississippi. In order to ensure an eternal peace between the crown and all other nations of the North American continent, King George III issued a royal proclamation in 1763, proclaiming that from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi, from Quebec to Florida, that whole area would be Indian country, and the English would only settle between the Appalachians and the coast. This royal proclamation would be a reoccurring source of indigenous claims of skullduggery on the part of the settlers. While it obviously didn't last in practice, it is still an important element of Canadian Indigenous relations, wherein the Crown recognized Aboriginal sovereignty over Aboriginal land. For the English civilians in the 13 colonies, denying them the right to settlement after conquest was an unforgivable betrayal by the Crown, and would be one of the motivators towards the upcoming and curiously ongoing American independence experiment. Pontiac was vilified in his time by white settlers, but his martial spirit was evoked in the naming of the town of Pontiac, Michigan. The Pontiac of General Motors fame, which was discontinued in 2010, and more locally, the Pontiac region of Quebec, faces the Ottawa River in the west end of Ottawa and is well known for hunting, fishing, and forestry. The Peace of Niagara was most significant for the Ottawa area, as it ensured that the Ottawa Valley, just like the Ohio Valley and Illinois country, would remain in Indigenous hands forever, and settlers would be kept at bay, at least for the next little while. The Algonquin held on to the Ottawa River for longer than many others held on to their territory. The status quo was to be maintained for 10 years for the Algonquin, until the passing of the Quebec Act, the fifth and final of the so-called Intolerable Acts that forced the hand of the Americans towards their War of Independence. The Quebec Act is where we'll continue our story next week. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. This show is written, recorded, and produced by me, Brendan Ray. If you could take a few moments to leave us a review or a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever service you're using, that really helps. You can see the notes and links for this episode on my website at ottawahistoryhub.com, and follow us on Facebook at Ottawa History Hub or X-Twitter at OttHistoryHub. We are now on Blue Sky as well, under Ottawa History Hub. Take care, everybody. Have a great week. Advance, Ottawa. En avance.